I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop, as well as the panelists and participants. It really is a pleasure to speak about something that is really sort of marginalized in academic discourse, particularly in history, where people are sort of crypto-Marxists and don't like to admit it. At any rate, let's get to it. I mentioned earlier it's a bit early, so please excuse any sort of morning symptoms, whatever might arise. At any rate, the use of ideology, as it is found, say, in American mass media, is far more common and influential than the use of ideology found in contemporary theoretical criticism. This popular understanding of ideology is notional and extremely narrow. As a purely political phenomenon, ideology is to be understood as an obstacle to the unclouded perception of reality. Such an understanding is owed arguably to the term's origins and subsequent developments, occurring most influentially in the discourses of political theory, particularly Marxist theory. Crucial to long and complicated transformations of the term were Karl Mannheim, who supplied ideology with its social roots, and of course, Antonio Gramsci. His most famous contribution being the theory of hegemony. Both thinkers, unlike Marx himself, elevated ideology to the status of a phenomenon worthy of study in its own right. It is from the post-structurally psychoanalytically inflected work of Louis Althusser that contemporary Marxist theory and the tradition of Marxist-inflected sociological thought has radically reworked the concept of ideology in light of the more complex notion of subject formation provided by Freudian and then Lacanian psychoanalysis, and in light of the more elaborate system of ideological practices that have developed in late capitalist societies. This focus on societal practice and the phenomenon of subject formation poses a fundamental question to contemporary Marxist and post-Marxist theorists of ideology. Why do people accept and internalize conditions which they know to be disadvantageous? Why do informed people often act against their own material interests? Indeed, the Gramscian notion of hegemony, that is, the social cultural attainment and maintenance of political consensus without state force, begs such a question. Various answers can be and have been proposed. This paper takes its conceptual cues from Althusser's conception of ideology in his 1970 essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Notes Towards an Investigation. First, that ideology is what represents, go to the slide. First, ideology is what represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And second, that ideology has a material existence. Althusser argued that there is no ideology without an attendant practice, no practice without an attendant ideology. And ultimately, that ideology in general, this is ideology with a capital I, as opposed to its plurality of historically determined enunciations, those are the little i's, has the primary function of interpellation, of constituting concrete individuals as social subjects. In this context, the thrust of Althusser's answer to the above questions is that ideology's effect is to conceal its recruitment as it recruits its subjects. Like all obviousnesses, he says, the obviousness that you and I are subjects and that does not cause any problems is an ideological effect, the elementary ideological effect. The dynamics behind Althusser's process of ideological interpellation will provide us with a basis for determining to what degree ideology critique can be useful, both for students of pre-modern communities in general, and in particular for students of political activity in ancient Rome's late Republic. In the interest of time today, I have bracketed, I've bracketed a great deal of theoretical exposition of Althusser's position and my own relationship to it. Instead, I've opted to provide the proof with the pudding, so to speak, and dive into Althusserian inflected analysis of late Republican political discourse. I do feel it must be said here, however, Althusser's notion of ideology has been criticized as being oppressively totalizing for, among other things, his conclusion that no individual can ever step outside of ideology. As soon as someone believes themselves to be outside of ideology, then that is precisely the moment that they are most within ideology's grip. The Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek is instructive on this point. When we inevitably denounce as ideological the very attempt to demarcate a clear line between ideology and actual reality, one must avoid the ideological trap lurking therein in the form of an apparent conclusion, quote, that the only non-ideological position is to renounce the very notion of extra ideological reality and accept that all we are dealing with are symbolic functions, the plurality of discursive universes, never reality. And such a quick, slick, postmodern solution, however, is ideology par excellence. So, as promised, I bracket at this point any further detailed theoretical exposition and pass from theorization and critique of ideology to ideology critiques, applications, and methodological limitations. In doing so, we should keep in mind Althusser's dictum that the structure and function of ideology, with a capital I, itself has no history. Put simply, every class society has been, is, and will be embedded in ideology. It would seem that so long as human societies exist, so also will the class antagonism which engenders ideological reality. It now remains to be seen how ideology critique may be relevantly applied to the study of pre-modern historical societies, and in particular to the study of the politics and political crises which define late Republican Rome for modern observers. Now, the term ideology is used sporadically by modern historians and classicists working on late Republican Rome and the Augustan Principate. When the term is used at all in a modern analysis, it either appears without explanation, remaining unclear in its relation to any particular theoretical approach, or is inconsistently conceptualized across accounts. Arguably, one exception to this sort of rule is are the essays actually collected in Steele, Gray, and Vanderbilt's 2018 collection, Institutions and Ideology in Republican Rome. That said, this is a kind of crypto-Marxist collection, right? It doesn't quite actually explicitly name the Marxist influence, which are all of there. The fingerprints are all over it. But it's still, that's a bright spot, I would say. More often than not, right, ideology makes an appearance in scholarly discussions about ancient Rome's political history in order to be dismissed as irrelevant. This dismissal has been documented by one classicist and historian, T.P. Wiseman, who refers to this lacuna at the heart of prevalent accounts of Roman politics as the ideological vacuum. Since we're in mixed company, I go a bit through what Wiseman's argument is. For Wiseman, political ideology has a textual basis that should not be ignored. The term finds its Roman equivalent in the term partes, i.e. normal Latin, for political or ideological grouping, Wiseman says. Dismissals of ideology, however, also cite a textual basis by pointing to choice passages from Cicero's corpus. Famously, Cicero argued in March of 56 BC as a political defense of an optimate tribune, that there were always, semper, two natural types, genera, of politician in the citizen body. The best men, the optimates, and the popularity seekers, populares. What matters in determining whether or not Roman politics was significantly ideological are the premises of Cicero's argument. What does not matter is the truth or falsity of Cicero's reading of early Roman history. See his semper. Right? Nor is it the specific characterizations of those types of politicians, those types. Cicero's historical reading and characterizations both served, inter alia, to justify his polity's present state of affairs. The Republic was divided into two rival ideological camps, two partes, or, as Cicero tendentiously put it, two genera, or natural types. We should remember, as Wiseman rightly stresses, that our most explicit evidence comes from within the conflict itself. It is in the highest degree tendentious, but it simply cannot be waved away as an anachronism, he says. Simply put, ideology in late Republican politics can be located and examined in those political divisions which Romans made on matters of principle. More specifically, ideology can be identified as those principal commitments which politicians were intent on living by, acting upon, and or dying for. Wiseman has shown that the theoretical framework which results from this vacuum is highly influenced on the one hand by the great man thesis of history, insistent upon a puppet-like, politically uninfluential populace, and on the other hand, by attendant readings of Macht Politik, which derive from the powerful perspective of British and continental scholars who wrote as they observed the global rise of nationalist movements and autocratic regimes during the 20th century. Primarily responsible are two pioneering studies of prosopography, the first being Matthias Geltzer's Die Nobilität der Römischen Republik in 1929, the second being Sir Ronald Syme's massively popular study, The Roman Revolution, published in 1939, which details the Emperor Augustus's purportedly cynical rise to power. T.P. Wiseman nicely sums up their respective positions. For Geltzer, he says, political life was the pursuit of power, that is, election to office by the exploitation of personal and patronal relationships. No parties, factions were just ad hoc combinations to secure election. When Syme uses this word party, he has overtones of Europe in the 1930s. Power is for its own sake. So Geltzer gave you the norm, aristocrats exploiting connections and patronates to get their consulships, and Syme gave you the crisis. As power was usurped by Augustus, and I love this quote, a chill and mature terrorist. Either way, you were not to suppose that there were causes that men would die for. Okay. As Wiseman points out, this framework is nearly ubiquitous in the assumptions of classical history written during the late 20th century. In fact, it continues to be powerful, having long entered the realm of accepted fact in basic historical analysis. Consider one recent characterization chosen nearly at random of the controversial political reforms established by the Civil War general and Roman dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla during the late 80s BC. Yet on balance, what is most striking is how little Sulla sought to change the basic nature of the Republic. For all the viciousness with which leaders in Rome's internal struggles fought each other, these conflicts rarely had any significant ideological basis. Men fought to seize power or to prevent it passing to a hated rival, though some revolutionaries made promises of grants of land or abolition of all standing debts in order to win support. No one seems to have planned to change the way the Republic worked in any of its fundamentals. The chief aim was always for a leader and his associates to supplant those who currently dominated the state. Sulla won such a victory, and the cornerstone of these reforms was to pack the Senate with his partisans. Written by the Oxford-educated military historian Adrian Goldsworthy, this excerpt might serve as a virtual digest of the analytical framework pioneered by Geltzer and popularized by Syme before the mid-20th century. Not only do we see Geltzer's ideological vacuum operating at the literal heart of Goldsworthy's account, we also see Syme's solution to the consequent problem of how modern observers should now characterize the sources of Roman political motivation and conflict. The conclusion is that there was no fundamental difference between Sulla, the Senate's champion, and the revolutionaries who passed popular legislation in their capacities as tribunes of the plebs. At stake was the furtherance of individual political careers, the chief aim of securing and maintaining dominance in the Roman state. Wiseman argues, however, that even if these sorts of conclusions turned premises are accepted as a plausible image of how Roman politics worked, they yield paradoxical results as soon as we apply closer scrutiny. For instance, we could easily respond to Goldsworthy's conclusions about the activities of popularis tribunes with the exact words that Wiseman responds to the assertions that Meyer makes in his 1965 Paulo Wissowa article on popularis. It was stated without argument and with no sense of paradox that the popularis ratio was a political method, as it were a career choice for achieving one's own ambitions. One might have thought that the deaths of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, Saturninus, Livius Drusus, Sulpicius, and Clodius were prima facie evidence that being a radical tribune was not likely to bring you to the consulship. That is, if violence and death proved time and time again that the consulship was not guaranteed to tribunician revolutionaries, then apparently there were principles and causes that men would die for. Consider then the paradoxical consequences of the ideological vacuum in Goldsworthy's thinking about the dictator Sulla and his much debated constitutional reforms of the late 80s BC. Not only are we to note, quote, how little Sulla tried to change the basic nature of the Republic, but also that the cornerstone of these reforms was to pack the Senate with Sulla's partisans. Other unavoidable considerations, however, call both of those assertions into questions. By the cornerstone of these reforms, Goldsworthy can only be referring to Sulla's enlargement of the Senate, when the dictator enrolled 300 new senators, thereby doubling the body's former number to 600. Indeed, the new senators, some demonstrably personal adherents, were not likely to be drawn from Sulla's opponents. One historian has even suggested that the new members very well might have served generally both as a pledge for the maintenance of Sulla's reforms and as a check to any changes that future magistrates might want to introduce. But we should also remember that the enlarged body also works to serve practical purposes germane to both the functioning of criminal courts and to the administration of the empire. But it's difficult to maintain that Sulla was merely absorbed by self-interested and/or practical considerations. Even if we concede that Sulla would not have wanted to surround himself with men from the losing side of a civil war that he initiated, the notion that Sulla's supposedly ideology-free reforms did not try to change the quote-unquote basic nature of the Republic falls flat when we pause to consider the changes which he made with regard to the plebeian tribunate. While leaving untouched the plebeian requirement for the office, Sulla took away from the tribunes their right to introduce legislation. He severely limited their right of veto, the people's traditional check upon the uses and excesses of senatorial power. He also barred tribunes from holding any further offices in the state, thereby engineering the gradual extinction of both the office and the power of the popular assembly. Senatorially aligned observers, and Cicero in particular, could characterize Sulla's actions against the tribunate as regrettable, while also conceding that his motivations were understandable. This is seen in the Laws, book 3, 22 to 25. In the words of the historian and classicist Catherine Steele, the trend of Sulla's thinking here seems easy to grasp, namely that every episode of domestic violence over the previous half century had at its heart a tribune of the people putting forward profoundly divisive legislative proposals. She names them, right? By removing the capacity for tribunician legislation, Sulla presumably hoped to eliminate the possibility of such internecine upheavals. But Sulla certainly knew an older history as well. He knew that the secession of the plebs nearly 400 years earlier had resulted not only in Rome's more representative popular assembly, in the office and powers of the tribunate, but also in the publication of Rome's earliest collections of laws, the 12 Tables. The tables contain the earliest evidence we possess that the legitimacy of the law in the Republic had from its virtual beginnings rested within the power of the Roman people and their ability to change the law. Quote, affairs of great importance shall not be transacted without the vote of the people, with whom rests the power to appoint magistrates, to condemn citizens, and to enact laws. And this is from Table 11. By stripping the tribunes of their right to introduce legislation, Sulla was unmistakably instituting reforms aimed at changing, quote, the basic nature of the Republic. At best, Sulla's actions show that he possessed a severely conservative understanding of who the people were, and they were not plebeian commoners. The patrum auctoritas, the authority of the patres, or the senators, was what came first. Our evidence indicates that Sulla saw the powers of the tribunes as tyrannical. Evidence even reveals that his actions and reforms were described at the time by Cicero as a victory for the nobilitas. It was in this language that Sallust, writing his Ugrissine War at the time of the civil war of 41 to 40 BC, would describe the consul Opimius' destruction of Gaius Gracchus and his followers as the victory of the nobilitas over the plebs. Nevertheless, when viewed from the other side of the political divide, Sulla and the supporters of his regime could be, and indeed were, regarded as tyrants. And Eckert has in fact shown that Sulla's reputation was divided well into the imperial period. In fact, the restoration of the tribune's powers became the main rallying cry of the Sullan opposition, and they were ceremoniously undone within a decade of their passage in 80 BC. By 75 BC, the bar on former tribunes holding other offices was removed, and by 70 BC, the consuls Pompey and Crassus restored the tribunate's unrestrained right of veto along with their ability to initiate legislation. As a prosecutor, arguing a corruption case against the former provincial governor Verres, Cicero capitalized upon the chance to chide the post-Sullan jury of senators in popularis terms for the fact that the res publica had too long put up with their, quote, kingly tyranny. And here you see it here, regiam istam vestram dominationem. But now all that was over. But in case you don't realize it, Cicero says, all that was snatched from you and taken away on the day the tribunes were, all of that was taken away from you and, or snatched from you and taken away on the day the tribunes were restored to the Roman people. It was dominatio and libertas, tyranny and freedom, that were at stake in the politics of the late Republic. In the face of this, it is difficult to maintain that either Sulla, his reforms, or the objections encountered were largely free of significant ideological force, or that Roman politics was only about the individual attainment of power, wealth, and glory by aristocrats. The people mattered. As T.P. Wiseman puts it, for Syme, the strife was for power, wealth, and glory. For Sallust, and even Cicero, it was for liberty, glory, or domination. The difference is not insignificant. Now, here's where we map political ideologies in the late Republic in Rome. Here's a quote from one of my own mentors, William W. Badstone. This is preserved in a book by Anthony Caldelas. It reads, ideology is more personal than belief, since we can simply change our beliefs, less conscious than knowledge or reasons, and larger than the individual. So I thought that would be good for some pondering. So if T.P. Wiseman's discussion accurately reminds us that the terms ideology and ideological can and should describe the principal commitments held and acted upon by Romans in their historically determined political groupings, then an Althusserian understanding of ideology calls us to remain sensitive to the various types of ideological spaces which may be represented within the sources that provide us with our materials for reconstructing and constructing the past. For instance, when faced again with Cicero's tendentious characterizations about populares and optimates, what matters is not the positive content, that is, the truth or falsity of his assertions. What matters are the particular discursive moments where this content is functional with regard to some real relation of social domination, power, or exploitation in an inherently non-transparent way. The very logic of legitimizing the relation of domination must remain concealed if it is to be effective. In general terms, whatever is ideological is such in the sense that it seeks to convince us of its truth, its naturalness and obviousness, but actually serves some unavowed power interest. On the other hand, the Althusserian perspective first calls us to acknowledge the ideological nature of the various source materials which we use to conduct historical inquiry. For the purposes of our discussion of Roman history, I will deal primarily with textual sources, solely with the sources which contribute to an exploration of political ideology during the late Republic. Simply put, our historical sources are the fragmentary products of social practices which often mislead by some similarity shared with our own, but are in actuality long gone. Still, be they textual or purely material, both types of historical sources are accurately described as Rome's ideological artifacts. For instance, the vast majority of texts which allow us to tell the Republic's story are products of habits and attitudes cultivated by a wealthy land and office-holding class of soldiers, men who desired, ideally, to distinguish themselves both militarily as well as domestically in their sharing of power and in their competitive and collegial contributions to the res publica. I will skip the next slide in the interest of time. With regard to ideology, it would seem that the Roman reality offered by our text will best be able to illuminate the dominant ideologies of aristocratic office holders, be they adherent or sympathetic to optimates or populares political principles. Due to the nature of our sources, it's difficult to know much about the ideologies that may or may not have been prevalent among the poor voters of the popular assemblies. On the other hand, there was at least one highly detectable ideological master signifier that became a rallying point for defenders and champions of both the Senate and the people: libertas, or freedom. In legal terms, the word had no meaning outside of citizenship in a state. For the Romans, to be free meant not to be a slave. In practical and thus ideological terms, this word came to mean different things for different classes of Roman citizens by the late Republic, and its significance hinged upon the distinction between freedom from and freedom to. The plebs, and the institutional powers and sacrosanctity of the tribunate, and the citizen's basic right of appeal were seen as possessing the freedom from having to endure arbitrary punishment or physical abuse by officials of the Roman state, freedom from. Take Gaius Manlius, the ex-centurion, who became the leader of the peasant revolt in 63 BC. In Salus Bellum Catilinae, he's made to say, quote, "Not one of us was allowed the traditional protection of the law, or to keep our bodies free, liberum, when our inheritance was lost. Such has been the savagery of the moneylenders and the magistrate. Senators, however, possess the same freedom as the plebs and more. As leaders and fathers, or patres of the republic, they felt that their body's collective moral, religious, and military superiority granted its members the freedom to do as they saw fit, as it resulted from their own superior capabilities of judgment." So for instance, in his laws, book 3, 22 to 25, Cicero stages a conversation between himself and his brother Quintus about the nature and history of the tribunate. Cicero has Quintus say of Gaius Gracchus, quote, "What devastation he caused, devastation, which could only have been caused by the madness or furor of a filthy beast, lacking any vestige of sense or any prospect of success, and inflamed by the madness of a mob. That is why in this instance I strongly approve of Sulla, who by his law stripped the plebeian tribunes of their destructive power, leaving them only the right to give assistance." Cicero then responds. Ooh, sorry, that was Quintus's right there. Went too far. Cicero then responds, "I admit there is an element of evil inherent in the office of tribune, but without that evil, we would not have the good, which was the whole purpose of setting it up. The plebeian tribunes, you say, have too much power. Who is arguing with that? But the crude power of the people is much more savage and violent. By having a leader, it is sometimes milder than if it had none. For the leader knows he is going ahead at his own risk, whereas the surging mass is blind to the risk it is running. Think of the good sense which our forefathers showed in this matter. That is why the king should never have been expelled, or else the plebs had to be given actual, not just nominal freedom. In fact, that freedom was given in such a way that the common people were induced by many excellent regulations to acquiesce in the aristocrat's authority." Now, there's tons to unpack here, but I'll be very brief. Operative in both Cicero and Quintus's assertion is the opposition between mad, savage animals and human beings with sense. But what is truly at stake in this opposition? While Quintus blames the tribunes themselves, Cicero blames the common people. The upshot, says Cicero, is that the plebs in their animal madness cannot be expected to live without the regulations of sensible aristocrats. Such madness is proof that the state can only tolerate plebs with nominal freedom, not the real freedom he and Quintus enjoy. But Cicero can only reach these conclusions because he has elided the fact the plebs and their leaders had complaints that were neither incomprehensible nor inconsistent. There was indeed a distinct ratio. We know that at least since the Gracchi, or for 400 years, according to Cicero's Pro Sestio passage, the main recurring themes of the struggle of the orders were corn supply, land distribution, and debt. Plus, Gaius Gracchus's tribunate of 123 introduced the first pre-planned program of reforms into the city. Cicero portrays himself as a defender of the tribunate, but what he truly defends is the auctoritas principium to which the commoners of the ancestors yielded. Cicero's characterization of the plebs as animals devoid of ratio is spoken in the interest of a class that refuses, so the plebs complain, to treat them or even regard them as human beings. In terms of class domination, ideology makes the subordinate dirty so that the maker can call her filthy and feel that justice is done when he turns her away in the name of cleanliness. Are not Cicero's statements then ideology par excellence? Thank you.